For months, Eva Sinclair endured the cruelty of Connor Tate without saying a word. She stayed silent, pretending not to hear the whispers, the laughter, the subtle digs. Every day was the same. She sat alone at lunch, kept her head down in the halls, and walked through the school like a shadow, blending into the background as best as she could. West Ridge Middle School wasn't a place where fists were often thrown, but the battle lines were clear. There were silent wars fought with nothing more than a look, a glance, a whisper. Who belonged? Who didn't? Who mattered? Who didn't? Eva had been a student at West Ridge for as long as she could remember, but she had always been the outsider. As one of the few black students at the school, Eva learned early that blending in wasn't an option. She could never be invisible enough to avoid the whispers, the stares, or the occasional cruel joke. So she did the next best thing. She became as unnoticed as possible. She stayed in the background, walked as quickly as she could through the halls, and ate her lunch alone in the farthest corner of the cafeteria. But Connor Tate wouldn't let her be. Connor was the kind of kid who thought the world revolved around him. He was the son of a local businessman, popular and powerful, with friends in all the right places. Teachers praised him, parents invited him to their pool parties, and he walked through the school like he owned the place. Connor could do no wrong, and for the past month, Eva had become his favorite target. It started small, shoving her books off her desk, bumping into her in the hallways, tripping her on the stairs. Little things that no one would call bullying, but Eva knew what they were, and it never stopped. Today, it was her lunch. Eva was barely halfway through her peanut butter sandwich when she felt a hand snatch her paper bag from the table. She looked up, and there he was, Connor, grinning like he was the king of the world. "What you got, Sinclair?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Peanut butter? Seriously? Guess your dad's new job doesn't pay enough for real food." The laughter rippled through the table behind him as he ripped open the bag, inspecting her sandwich with exaggerated disgust. Eva's fingers curled into fists under the table, her jaw tightening, but she stayed silent. She had learned long ago that silence was the safest option, but this time, it wasn't enough. Connor leaned in, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You know, you should really thank me. I'm just trying to help you with your diet." With that, he tossed the sandwich over his shoulder, watching it land with a soft splat on the floor. His friends snickered, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink. It was just Eva, the ruined sandwich, and the sound of their laughter ringing in her ears. She wasn't going to cry, not here, not in front of them. Without saying a word, she grabbed her backpack and stood up, pushing past the tables, ignoring the stares and the snickers. She walked past the cafeteria doors, past the lockers, and all the way to the girls' bathroom. Once inside, she locked herself in a stall and sat down on the closed toilet lid. This was nothing new. She had been through it before. She would wait until the bell rang, slip out of the bathroom, and pretend like none of it had happened. Because telling someone never worked. Teachers would say, "Just ignore him," and the principal would call it a misunderstanding. The next day, it would all start again. But this time, something was different. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would fight back. And tomorrow, Connor Tate would push her further than he ever had before. The next morning, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. The same cruel routine of Connor's taunts and taunting glances had been wearing her down. But this time, she was determined to change things. She wouldn't be silent anymore. It started before first period. Eva was at her locker trying to grab her books and organize her things for class when she felt something slam into her back hard. She stumbled forward, her forehead almost smacking into the cold metal of the locker. Laughter echoed from behind her, and she turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Connor. "My bad, Sinclair," he said with a smirk, leaning against the lockers as if this was all just some kind of joke. Eva's fist clenched at her sides, but she kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. She said nothing. It was what he wanted. A reaction, any reaction. But Eva was determined to show him she was stronger than that. That was until lunchtime. When she walked into the cafeteria, something felt off. The usual buzz of chatter and clinking of trays was present, but the whispers, the ones that followed her everywhere she went, they were louder now, sharper. Eva made her way to her usual spot, the farthest corner of the cafeteria, where she could eat alone. She barely noticed the stares or the murmurs at first. That was until she overheard one of the conversations as she passed by a group of students. "Did you hear? She tried to fight Connor," someone said in a voice just loud enough for Eva to hear. "No way. She swung on him and everything. Bet she cried afterward." The words sliced through her like a knife. It was a rumor, a lie, but it spread so quickly, like wildfire, and everyone was buying it. Eva froze in her tracks. Her mind raced. How had they found out? Who was spreading this nonsense? She stood there for a moment, trying to process the conversation, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. She could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on her. Every whisper, every snicker, every sideways glance. She didn't have to look back to know they were all staring at her, judging her. She took a deep breath and walked to her seat. The cafeteria felt suffocating, smaller than usual. She sat alone that day, and the next day, and the next. It didn't stop there. The rumors about her spread like a disease, infecting every corner of the school. By Friday, she was sure that Connor had won. He had succeeded in making her the object of ridicule, in turning everyone against her. She had become the joke, the outcast. It was like she didn't even exist anymore. Just a punchline in a story everyone else was telling. But it wasn't over yet. By the time the final bell rang on Friday, Eva thought she could breathe. The weekend was here. She could go home, escape it all for 2 days. But then as she was halfway across the parking lot, she heard the voice behind her. "Hey, Sinclair." She didn't look back. She couldn't. "Where are you going?" Connor called, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I thought we were friends." Eva's stomach turned. She kept walking, hoping he would just leave her alone. But that wasn't going to happen. Before she could react, Connor grabbed her wrist, pulling her back toward him. "Don't touch me," Eva snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She pulled away from him, spinning around to face him. Connor didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked, his friends behind him laughing like it was all just a game. "Relax," Connor said, flicking her backpack strap. "I just wanted to say hi." Eva's heart pounded in her chest. She was done being the victim. She was done hiding. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice low but filled with anger. But Connor wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Or what? You gonna tell on me?" Eva's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her words cutting through the air. But Connor wasn't done. His friends chuckled behind him, egging him on. Connor flicked the strap of her backpack again, and then he said something that made her snap. "You're just mad because nobody cares." In that moment, something inside Eva broke. Maybe it was the months of harassment. Maybe it was the relentless bullying. But at that moment, it didn't matter. She had had enough. Without thinking, Eva shoved him. Hard. Connor stumbled back, caught off guard for the first time. The laughter from his friends died down, and for a brief second, there was silence. Eva's heart raced in her chest. She had never touched him before, never fought back, but she had done it now. Connor's smirk faltered, and the amusement in his eyes turned to something else, anger. But Eva didn't wait to see what he would do next. She grabbed her backpack, spun around, and walked away as quickly as she could. The parking lot was quiet again, but Eva's mind was loud. She had done it. She had fought back. But what would happen next? She had no idea. That night she barely slept. Her mind raced with thoughts of Connor's face when she pushed him, the anger in his eyes, his friends' laughter. She had never stood up for herself like that before. She didn't know what would come of it, but she was done being silent. And tomorrow she would find out just how far Connor was willing to take it. The night was restless. Eva tossed and turned in her bed, her mind replaying the scene in the parking lot over and over. Connor's stunned expression, the brief moment of silence after she shoved him, his friends' shocked faces. She hadn't expected it to go that far, but she wasn't sorry, not anymore. What worried her was the uncertainty of what would happen next. Would Connor escalate? Would he come after her harder than before? Would the entire school turn on her for standing up for herself? She had no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. She was done being afraid. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The next morning, as she walked into school, Eva felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The halls seemed different now. The whispers felt louder. The eyes of the students felt heavier as she walked past them, every pair of eyes watching, judging, waiting. But there was one thing she noticed. Today, for the first time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. The stairs weren't the same as they used to be. They weren't filled with pity or derision. They were filled with something else. Respect. Even if it was just a little bit. By the time she reached her locker, Eva could already feel the tension mounting. She tried to block out the stares, the comments, the mutterings. But as she reached for her books, she heard the unmistakable sound of a voice behind her. "Nice photos, Sinclair." Eva froze. She recognized the voice immediately. It was Lena Carmichael, one of Connor's friends. The same girl who had been in on the jokes, the rumors, the cruelty. Eva turned slowly, her heart pounding. Lena was smirking, her phone in hand. Eva's stomach twisted. She didn't need to look at the phone to know what it was. She could already feel her body tense up, her breath catching in her throat as Lena tapped the screen. Eva quickly fumbled for her own phone in her bag, but when she unlocked it, her worst fear was confirmed. The photo, the one of her pushing Connor in the parking lot. Only now it had been edited. Her face was twisted with exaggerated anger, her features distorted. And across the top of the image, in bold red letters, the words read, "Psycho Sinclair can't control herself." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. The first one made her stomach turn. "Wow, she looks unhinged. No wonder she has no friends." The others followed quickly. "I heard she tried to scratch his face. Connor should have hit her back." Eva's throat closed up as she forced herself to swallow. She wanted to scream, to throw her phone against the wall. But she didn't. Not here, not in front of them. Instead, she stayed silent, keeping her eyes on the floor. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Lena leaned in, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Connor says you have a temper problem. Maybe you should get some help." Eva's pulse hammered in her ears. She had never felt so humiliated in her life. The whole school had seen the photo by now. The rumors weren't just whispers anymore. They were out there for everyone to see, to believe, and there was nothing she could do about it. She sank into her desk in English class, barely hearing the lesson. The whispers, the snickers, the sideways glances. It all blurred together. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't escape. By lunchtime, the entire school was talking about her. The photo had spread everywhere. It was all anyone could talk about, and it wasn't even the truth. It was a lie, a distortion. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. As Eva sat at her usual spot in the cafeteria, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, the same seat she had taken day after day. She wasn't surprised that no one came to sit with her. What did surprise her was the sound of footsteps approaching her table. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Lena Carmichael. For a moment, Eva thought Lena was going to make fun of her again, to throw one last insult her way. But instead, Lena sat down across from her without saying anything. She pushed her food around with her fork, her eyes not quite meeting Eva's. "Guess you, got the last laugh, huh?" Lena finally said, her voice softer than Eva had expected. Eva didn't answer at first. She stared at Lena for a moment, processing the shift. This wasn't the girl who had laughed at her, who had spread the rumors. Lena looked uncomfortable, not smug, not superior. Eva's fingers tightened around her fork, her gaze flicking back to the table. She had no energy for this. No energy to play the game anymore. She wanted to be left alone. "You just laughed," Eva said quietly, her voice colder than she meant it to be. Lena winced. The apology she was about to offer clearly stuck in her throat. Eva could see the guilt in her eyes, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Empathy. I didn't mean to make it worse," Lena said, her voice faltering. I didn't know how bad it was." Eva shook her head, her thoughts swirling. "You didn't know, but you still laughed." Lena opened her mouth, but no words came out. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fork still poking at her food. Finally, Ava stood up, her tray in hand. She didn't need to say anything else. She didn't have to explain. Lena had made her choice, and Ava had made hers. With a quiet sigh, Eva walked away, leaving Lena sitting there, her head down, fiddling with her food. As she walked out of the cafeteria, something inside her shifted. She wasn't the same girl she had been when she walked in. Connor Tate had tried to break her. He had pushed her to the edge, and he had thought he'd won. But what he hadn't counted on was Ava fighting back. And what Lena hadn't realized was that Ava didn't need an apology. She needed to be seen. And now, for the first time, people were starting to see her. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was enough. And that night, as Eva sat in the living room, her father's voice broke the silence. "How's school?" he asked, his tone casual but observant. "Better," Eva replied, her fingers curling around the edges of her book. "Better than last week?" "Yeah, better than last week," she said. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The next few days passed in a blur. School felt different now. For the first time, Eva wasn't walking around with her head down, pretending to be invisible. She wasn't hiding from the whispers and the stares. She had made her choice. She would no longer let anyone decide her worth for her. The days of silently enduring were over. The morning after Lena had sat with her, Eva walked through the halls with a quiet confidence she hadn't had before. The air felt different, charged with something Eva couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the fact that people were finally starting to see her, not as the target of bullying, but as someone who fought back. She knew there was still a long way to go. The rumors, the photo, and the whispering hadn't just disappeared, but things were starting to shift. At lunch that day, Eva walked into the cafeteria, her eyes scanning the room as she made her way to the same spot she had sat for weeks. But this time, something was different. A girl from her math class, someone she barely knew, was sitting at the table across from her. "Mind if I sit here?" the girl asked, her voice hesitant but kind. Eva looked at her for a moment, a little surprised. No one had ever asked to sit with her before. It was always her in the corner, eating alone. But now someone was asking. Eva nodded, her fingers tightening around her tray. "Go for it." The girl smiled, and they both settled into a quiet rhythm. The awkwardness was there at first, but it didn't last long. The girls started talking about a homework problem they had in math, and soon Eva found herself laughing, engaging in a conversation she would have never had before. She wasn't alone anymore, not in the way she used to be. After lunch, when the bell rang and everyone shuffled back to class, a few other students passed by her, giving her nods of acknowledgement. One even said, "Hey, Eva, I heard about what happened with Connor. That was messed up." Eva nodded back, her heart swelling slightly. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. It was recognition. And for the first time, it felt like people were beginning to see the truth. Not the rumors, not the lies, but the reality of what had happened. By the end of the day, Eva couldn't help but notice the shift in the way people were treating her. It wasn't just the whispers that had stopped, but the way they looked at her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was standing tall. She was being seen. As she left school that afternoon, walking across the parking lot toward the bus stop, Eva felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. She wasn't sure what the next day would bring, or the day after that, but for the first time, she felt like she had control over her own life. She wasn't going to let Connor Tate or anyone else dictate her worth anymore. But even with all the changes, Eva knew there were still challenges ahead. The bullying wouldn't just stop because she had stood up for herself once. And it wasn't just Connor who needed to be held accountable. It was everyone who had silently watched as he tore her down. Everyone who had stood by and done nothing. That night after dinner, Eva sat at the kitchen table with her father. He was reading the newspaper, his cup of coffee steaming beside him. Eva was quiet for a moment, her mind racing with everything that had happened. Her father looked up from the paper. "How was your day?" "It was better," Eva said, her voice steady. "I didn't sit alone at lunch today. A girl from math class asked if she could sit with me. It felt normal." Her father raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you." Eva nodded, though she felt like there was more to say. She had been through so much. She had fought hard to get to this point. But it wasn't just about standing up to Connor. It was about reclaiming her own story. You know, her father said after a moment, setting the newspaper down and taking a sip of his coffee. When I was your age, there was a kid like Connor. He thought he could push me around, that he could make me feel small. I didn't fight back at first. I didn't know how, but I learned. And one day I made my choice. I wasn't going to let him define me anymore. I wasn't going to let him control my life. Eva looked at him, her eyes wide. What happened? Her father smiled softly. I stopped running. I stopped hiding. I stood up for myself, and I made sure that what he did to me never happened again. Eva took that in, her thoughts swirling. She had been running for so long, hiding in the shadows, letting the bullying define her. But now she had made her choice. She was done being afraid. Thanks, Dad, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I think I'm starting to get it now. Her father smiled, his eyes warm. You're stronger than you know. The next morning when Eva walked into school, she walked with her head held high. The halls were still filled with the usual noise and chaos, but today it felt different. As she walked toward her locker, she noticed a few familiar faces. Students who had once ignored her, avoided her, or worse, now gave her nods of acknowledgement. There were still whispers. There were still people who didn't understand. But now Eva didn't need their approval. She wasn't seeking validation from anyone anymore. She had learned that her worth wasn't defined by the lies people told about her, the rumors they spread, or the actions of those who tried to tear her down. And as she walked into the cafeteria that day, she didn't go to her usual spot. This time she walked to a table where two girls from her history class were sitting. They smiled at her as she approached, and one of them moved her tray to make room for Eva. Mind if I sit here? Eva asked, her voice steady but hopeful. The girl nodded. Of course. We were just talking about the history project. Eva smiled as she sat down, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in months. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something greater, her future, her sense of self, and her right to be seen. And as the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, Eva knew that this was only the beginning. She had made it through the hardest part, and now she was stronger than she had ever been before. Connor Tate might have tried to break her, but in the end, it was Eva who had become unbreakable. By the end of the week, things at school had settled in ways Eva hadn't anticipated. The whispers had quieted, the rumors had faded, and for the first time in a long time, Eva could walk through the halls without feeling like a target. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Connor Tate was gone. His suspension had been final, and the rumors had stopped. His presence, once looming and oppressive, had disappeared as quickly as it had come. In the weeks that followed, the school seemed to forget about him, but Eva never did. What mattered wasn't just that he was gone. It was that she had survived. She had stood her ground. It wasn't just Connor she had been fighting all this time. It was the silence. The silence that allowed the bullying to continue unchecked. The silence that had made her feel like she didn't matter, that had allowed everyone to look the other way. But now the silence had broken. By the following Monday, Eva had noticed a subtle shift. It wasn't just that people stopped laughing at her, it was that they started standing with her. When she walked into class, there was no longer the awkward avoidance or the muttered words behind her back. She walked into the cafeteria and saw other students nodding at her in support. Lena Carmichael, who had once been part of the crowd that laughed at her, now sat with Eva every day. The other students who had ignored her for so long began including her in conversations, offering her a place in their groups and treating her as an equal. And yet, in the midst of the change, Eva didn't feel like she had won. She wasn't looking for a trophy or a public apology. What mattered to her was the realization that she had fought for herself and won her own respect. It wasn't about whether Connor came back or whether others accepted her. It was about the moment she chose to stop running and started standing tall. Her father had told her that actions have consequences. But what Eva learned was that silence, too, has its consequences. Silence enabled Connor's cruelty. Silence allowed the cycle of bullying to continue. But when she found her voice, when she stood up for herself, it wasn't just the bullies who were affected. It was everyone. It was the students who had watched in silence, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up. By the time the semester ended, Eva had become someone different. She wasn't just the quiet girl who sat alone at lunch. She wasn't just the girl who had been pushed around. She was someone who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. And when she looked back, it wasn't the bullying that stayed with her. It was the lesson she had learned, the lesson that no one should ever be afraid to stand up for themselves, no matter the cost. Because silence, no matter how loud it may seem, will always be louder when it's broken by someone who dares to speak out. Lesson from the story. The story of Eva Sinclair is one of resilience, courage, and growth. It teaches us that silence, while often seen as a way to avoid conflict, can sometimes be the most dangerous choice. The silence that allowed bullying to continue unchecked. The silence that made Eva feel like she didn't matter. These silences were broken when Eva chose to stand up for herself. The lesson here is simple. No one should ever feel small or invisible. We all have the right to stand up for ourselves, to speak out against injustice, and to refuse to let anyone define our worth. Bullying in any form thrives on silence and fear. But when we choose to speak, when we choose to fight back, not with violence, but with dignity and strength, that's when the power shifts. It's not easy. It takes courage, it takes strength, and it takes time. But in the end, the real victory lies not in the defeat of others, but in the triumph of our own voice. Just like Eva, we all have the ability to reclaim our power and ensure that no one, no matter how powerful they may seem, can ever make us feel small again. And perhaps, most importantly, this story teaches us that we are not alone. There will always be others who are watching, others who will stand with us once we find the courage to stand up. Eva's journey wasn't just about surviving, it was about learning to live on her own terms, with her head held high, no matter what others thought. And that's the greatest lesson of all. We define who we are, not the people who try to break us.